When I was living in Malaysia, my son's kindergarten teachers invited all of their international students to bring something to class that quintessentially represented their home nation's culture. My son decided he wanted to speak about baseball. So he brought in his little T-ball set and set that up in front of the class. Now, in a moment of 4-year-old enthusiasm, all of a sudden, he took the biggest swing and made the best contact with that ball that I'd ever seen him make. And the ball ricocheted off the back corner of the classroom and around the walls. Now, thankfully, everyone kept their heads that day, including the teachers who were standing along the back wall and the students who were seated on the floor in front of him. Fortunately, none of them got hurt. But you can imagine that my son made a pretty big impression on his classmates that day. All of a sudden, he was cool and baseball was cool. And I imagined that his classmates wanted to go home and exchange their badminton rackets for a baseball bat. But something strange happened when I left the classroom. As I was going outside, I met an Australian dad who was coming into class to actually be there for his own son's show and tell that morning. And he noticed I was an American. And he said, "Oh, what did your son bring into class today? Tanks, guns, bombs, soldiers?" I was completely caught off guard by that remark. And when I went home on the drive, I was starting to ponder what actually took place in that communication. And I began to realize that some very strong stereotypes had actually been at play that morning. My son had playfully reinforced one of them. All American boys want to grow up to be baseball players. I had assumed a second stereotype, that all Malaysian kids want to grow up to be badminton champions. Now, Lee Chong-wei, the Malaysian badminton star, had just taken silver in the Beijing Olympics that year. So, was I wrong? But I'd felt attacked by a third stereotype, that America is a warmongering military nation. Well, the year was 2008. And all across international media, they were showing things about the American surge of troops into Iraq. So, was the Australian dad wrong? My point is this: cultural exposure is not enough. We were living in an incredibly multicultural environment, rich in Malaysia itself with Malay and Indian and Chinese, and then an international community with Australian and Japanese and British and Korean and more. But nonetheless, in spite of all that cultural exposure, strong stereotypes were still at work. And I realized it's possible to live and study abroad and actually have your stereotypes reinforced during your time. And that is definitely not the outcome that we're looking for. So I realized that if we're going to move our students on study abroad from cultural exposure to deep intercultural immersion learning, we needed to do these 7 things. First, we needed to actually get our students engaged in countering their stereotypes before they go abroad. Now, we can do this in some very simple ways using something called paired semantic differentials. On a sliding scale from 1 to 10, getting students perhaps going to the African continent, thinking about if they're going to Kenya, are they going to encounter a traditional culture? Or is it going to be modern, like downtown Nairobi? If they go to another place on the continent, Ghana for instance, are they going to encounter lush, scenic landscapes? Or are they anticipating it being dry and dusty and barren? How about our students going to Southeast Asia? Are they going to encounter crazy rich Asians? Or are they going to encounter some of the poorest of the poor? Addressing these stereotypes before people go abroad can just help remove some of the obstacles, because stereotypes act as filters that can be obstacles to actually encountering deep immersion learning. Second, we want to teach our students how to learn. You may be familiar with the classic story of the student and the fish and Agassiz. He's a Harvard professor in the late 1800s who taught his students how to do first-hand observation by studying this blasted fish. And he sent them day after day back to look at this blasted fish until they had to look, and finally, looking becomes seeing, and aha, seeing becomes understanding. Like Agassiz, we want to teach our students how to learn by doing first-hand observations themselves. We want to teach our students to begin to notice similarities and differences when they first get on the field. For instance, students going to study abroad in Thailand may notice that in the Thai culture they're called come, come, come with this kind of a gesture. And that to call someone with this kind of a gesture that they may use in their home country is actually incredibly rude and is actually reserved for calling dogs or perhaps even prostitutes. How about a student studying abroad in Europe, in France, for instance? They may learn and notice that the kids in the classroom that they're volunteering in begin to count on their thumb. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or students that are studying in Southeast Asia, that they count number 1 on their pinky first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Whereas for us in America, it's always number 1, right? With our index finger. These are superficial observations at the beginning, but students then learn to build on these the longer they're in their culture overseas and start to notice other things like how the culture is organized with time versus events, or is it a relational culture, or is it task-oriented? And so students develop these skills to start to build towards genuine immersion learning. Third, we want to teach our students how to ask questions. That may seem simple, but you'll be surprised how that is actually a learned skill. And if we don't learn to ask questions, we actually assume that we know and understand. And that can often lead to confirmation bias. A friend of mine was teaching in Malaysia for his first time in a rural village. And as he stood before the class and was teaching, he suddenly noticed that his students' focus had shifted from him to something on the wall behind him. He looked nervously over his shoulder, and he noticed this 6 to 8 inch colorful lizard climbing the wall behind him. And he noticed the colors and thought, that looked a little bit like a poisonous dart frog he had seen in a National Geographic. He looked back at his class of students, trying to read from them if he should be concerned. And in that process, he interpreted their steady gaze over his shoulder as genuine concern for his welfare. He looked again, and this lizard now was climbing up the wall, and it was just above him. And he was a tall man, so it was just a few inches away. He was now visibly nervous himself, and he looked back out into his audience again. And they started to mirror his own emotions. And so he quickly decided, yes, I'm reading them right. This must be a dangerous lizard. And he packed up his things and he retreated to a place of safety. Now, if he had stopped to ask the class of students, they would have gleefully told him that this was a gecko. That this lizard, even though it was brightly colored and perhaps shared some similarities to a poison dart frog in its coloring, the only thing that it was dangerous to was the insects and the spiders and the mosquitoes that it actually ate from the homes where these lizards were often found. But because he didn't ask, the students went away telling joyfully this story about this city-slicking American who knew nothing about Malaysian fauna. And he went home telling stories about his narrow escape from poisonous lizard. All right, we've got to teach our students to ask questions. Fourth, we've got to teach our students to become amateur ethnographers. What do I mean by this? Yes, we will do coursework. We'll get our students engaged in coursework to learn about social structures and history and government and religion when they're studying overseas. But we don't want all of their learning to be by the book. It's absolutely essential that we teach our students to field test what they're reading in their books. This gap is often brought home significantly when they study about the religion of the land. And then we actually get them out field testing and studying to learn to ask people locally what they actually believe. And there's often quite a difference between the religion of the land and the beliefs of the people. This is important to understand because it adds a whole new layer of complexity to our students' growth and understanding. And they have to learn to integrate what individuals believe and the cultural overlay with that overarching understanding of the religion. Fifth, we have to make language learning central, and not just for our Spanish or our French students. Culture, thought, language are all interdependent. Right? This was beautifully illustrated in the film Arrival. This film is based on a novella by Ted Chiang called The Story of Your Life. And in this film, aliens called heptapods by humans land in 12 different locations around the globe. And in each location, they are trying to find a way to communicate with these heptapods. And Louise, the main character, a linguist on the ground in America, immerses herself deeply in this alien language. And she finds her brain gets rewired in the process to actually experience reality in a non-linear way. And at a crisis moment during the film, she uses that new gift of perception to avert a global crisis, war perhaps, and to usher in this whole new era of global communication and cooperation. Now, if we could accomplish a little bit of that through getting our students language learning, we'd all be happy, right? Now, of course, it's controversial whether actually immersing yourself in a language, foreign language, will rewire your brain. But it is not controversial that immersing yourself in another language opens up the culture and the people and relationships to a whole new level of communication and understanding. Nelson Mandela said this: if you speak to a man in a language that he understands, that goes to his head. But if you speak to a man in his own language, that goes to his heart. Sixth, we've got to get our students engaged in meaningful service with local partners. This can often be an extremely humbling experience. And I had my first experience of this on one of my first trips into Kalimantan, into the jungles of Indonesia. And we took a long bus ride from Pontianak to Darak up in the mountains, and then it was a several-hour hike into the interior jungles. And when we got there, it was just getting dusk. After a nice dinner, that we were welcomed into these traditional homes on stilts, I was looking around and figuring, I've got to figure out where I can go to take care of, essential business. I was pregnant at that time with our first child, and I knew I'd have to avail myself of those services quite frequently. And so I asked our hosts, and I was taken outside, and with a broad sweep of the hand, I was shown the surrounding jungle. So, with flashlight in hand, I went off, ventured just deep enough into the jungle to ensure a little bit of privacy, but not far enough. I'd heard about people getting lost in the jungles of Indonesia and didn't want to become one of those casualties. But the next morning, I was surprised to find a building like this near the center of the village. And I asked people, why didn't you direct me here the night before instead of sending me off into the jungle? And the response that I got was, that's dirty, it's unclean, it's unsanitary, you want to stay away. And I watched people's behavior in the village over the next few days, and it's true, they ventured far around this set of outhouses. And I realized how easy it was for someone like me to come into these jungles and to efficiently problem solve their great need for sanitation. But if I wanted to be effective, I would have to learn to partner with locals, because the situation there was obviously much more complex than I understood. And seventh, we need to debrief with our students. It is absolutely essential to not skip this step, because debriefing helps solidify what they have actually learned and to integrate that back into the local understanding that now our students are going to have to live within. And we shouldn't be surprised that often in this step, many students start to think through what it is they're studying and decide, wow, there's some new skills and things I want to develop here. And they reshape their career choices, and they get these relationships cemented with other people who have had similar experiences abroad as theirs. There's recently been some legislation introduced that hopes to move the number of study abroad students from 330,000 annually that we have now to 1 million students annually over the next 10 years. People are recognizing that to be effective global citizens, we must equip our students for intercultural communication. If we're going to accomplish this task, it's time to redesign study abroad to move our students from cultural exposure to a place of deep immersion learning. Thank you.